They said she was just a housewife. They said she was crazy. When Yuki stood up in that cold mahogany courtroom to face her billionaire husband, without a lawyer, the entire room fell silent. Her husband, Julian, didn't just smile. He laughed in her face. He thought the victory was already his. He thought his high-priced attorneys had buried every secret he ever had. But he didn't know that for the last 2 years, while he was working late, Yuki wasn't sleeping. She was watching. And when she finally opened her mouth to speak, the laughter didn't just stop. It died. What she revealed next made the judge drop his gavel in shock. You think you know how a divorce ends? You have no idea. The fluorescent lights of the Superior Court of Manhattan hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to drill directly into Yuki's temples. Outside, the rain battered against the heavy glass windows, turning the New York skyline into a smear of grey and charcoal. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was suffocatingly dry. Yuki Vance sat alone at the defendant's table. She wore a simple navy blue dress she had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago. Her hands, resting on the polished oak table, were clasped tight, her knuckles white. There were no stacks of leather-bound files in front of her, no team of paralegals whispering strategy, just a single, battered notebook and a USB drive resting near her water glass. Across the aisle, the contrast was sickening. Julian Vance, the CEO of Vance Halloway Logistics, looked like he had just stepped out of a Forbes photo shoot. His charcoal suit was bespoke, tailored in London, costing more than the car Yuki had driven to the courthouse. He leaned back in his leather chair, checking his platinum Patek Philippe watch with an air of bored irritation. He wasn't worried. To him, this wasn't a legal battle. It was an administrative errand, a nuisance. Flanking him were 3 men. The leader was Marcus Thorne, the most feared divorce attorney on the East Coast. Thorne was known as the Butcher for a reason. He didn't just win cases, he dismantled lives. He was currently whispering something into Julian's ear, causing the billionaire to smirk and cast a pitying glance toward his wife. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Arthur C. Sterling entered the room. He was a man of few words and even less patience, known for ruling quickly and favoring hard evidence over emotional pleas. He took his seat, his eyes scanning the room over half-moon spectacles. "Docket number 4492, Judge Sterling announced, his voice gravelly. "Vance versus Vance, petition for divorce, full custody of the minor child, and asset division." The judge looked at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Thorne, you represent Mr. Vance?" "I do, Your Honor," Thorne said, standing smoothly, his voice a rich baritone that commanded attention. The judge shifted his gaze to Yuki. He frowned, looking at the empty chairs beside her. "Mrs. Vance, I do not see counsel present. Is your attorney running late?" Yuki stood up. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced her knees to lock. "No, Your Honor, I don't have an attorney." A ripple of murmurs went through the gallery behind them. The press was there. Julian was a public figure after all. "You don't have an attorney?" Judge Sterling repeated, looking over his glasses. "Mrs. Vance, given the complexity of the marital assets involved, a company valued in the billions, multiple international properties, I strongly advise against proceeding pro se. Mr. Vance has a formidable legal team." "I am aware, Your Honor," Yuki said, her voice shaking slightly, before she cleared her throat and found her strength. "But I cannot afford Mr. Thorne's fees, and my husband froze our joint accounts 6 months ago. I will represent myself." From the other table, a sound cut through the tension. It was a laugh. Julian Vance didn't even try to hide it. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement, followed by a shake of his head. He leaned toward Thorne, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "She thinks she's in a movie. This is pathetic. Let's wrap this up by lunch, Marcus. I have a tea time at 1. Thorne smirked, patting Julian's shoulder. "Easy, Julian. Let her play lawyer. It makes the appeal impossible when she loses." Judge Sterling's gavel banged once. "Mr. Vance, you will maintain decorum in my courtroom." "Apologies, Your Honor," Julian said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, though his eyes danced with mockery. "It's just, absurdity has a way of being funny. My wife has a degree in art history. The most complex thing she's ever managed is a grocery list. I'm just trying to save the court's time." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," the judge snapped. He turned back to Yuki. "Mrs. Vance, are you absolutely sure?" Yuki looked at Julian. She saw the arrogance that had crushed her for 10 years. She saw the man who had convinced her she was worthless, that she was lucky he married her, that she was nothing without his money. "I'm sure, Your Honor," Yuki said softly. "Very well." The judge sighed, opening the file. "Mr. Thorne, your opening statement." Marcus Thorne didn't walk. He prowled. He moved to the center of the courtroom, unbuttoning his suit jacket to look more relatable, though his shoes cost more than most people's rent. He didn't look at Yuki. He looked at the judge, man to man. "Your Honor," Thorne began, "this case is tragic, not because a marriage is ending, but because of the delusion driving it." He gestured vaguely toward Yuki. "We are not here to deny that Yuki Vance was a faithful wife for the first few years. We are here to present the reality of the last 2. The evidence will show that Mrs. Vance has suffered a severe break from reality. Driven by paranoia and jealousy, she has fabricated wild accusations against a man who is a pillar of this community." Thorne walked back to his table and picked up a thick stack of documents. "Mr. Vance is a titan of industry. He runs a logistics empire that employs 40,000 people. Mrs. Vance spends her days on internet forums, concocting conspiracy theories. We have affidavits from the household staff, the maid, the driver, the nanny, all stating that Mrs. Vance is erratic, neglectful, often intoxicated." Yuki gripped the edge of her notebook. Lies. Maria the maid had been fired 3 months ago and rehired by Julian's shell company the next day with a double salary. The driver was Julian's cousin. "Furthermore," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper, "we are submitting Exhibit A, a psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation, simply a top specialist, who diagnosed Mrs. Vance with narcissistic personality disorder and delusionary tendencies." Julian nodded solemnly from his seat, looking the picture of a heartbroken husband dealing with a crazy wife. "We are asking for the prenuptial agreement to be enforced strictly," Thorne said, hardening his tone. "She gets the apartment in Queens and $5,000 a month in alimony for 2 years. Mr. Vance retains full custody of their 7-year-old son, Leo, to protect the child from her instability. And Mr. Vance retains 100% of the company assets." Thorne turned to Yuki for the first time, a shark-like grin flashing for a split second. "She is unfit, Your Honor. Unfit to manage money and unfit to raise a child. We simply want to ensure she gets the help she needs, far away from Mr. Vance." Thorne sat down. The courtroom felt heavy. The narrative was set. The powerful, benevolent billionaire versus the unstable, gold-digging housewife. It was a story the court had seen 1,000 times. Judge Sterling rubbed his temples. He looked at Yuki with pity. "Mrs. Vance, you may present your opening statement." "Do you need a moment?" The room went silent. Julian checked his watch again, tapping his foot. He whispered to Thorne, "Watch her stutter. She's going to cry in 30 seconds." Yuki stood up. She didn't cry. She didn't stutter. She picked up her notebook, walked around the table, and stood in the exact spot Thorne had just vacated. She looked small in the large room, but she stood with a posture she hadn't held in years. She looked directly at Julian. For a second, his smirk faltered. Her eyes weren't sad. They were cold. "Your Honor," Yuki began. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "Mr. Thorne tells a compelling story. He speaks of delusions. He speaks of paranoia. He speaks of a woman who has lost her grip on reality." She paused, looking at the judge. "But I am not here to tell you a story. I am not here to tell you that my husband is a bad man. I am not here to tell you that he had affairs. The court doesn't care about feelings. The court cares about facts." She walked back to her table and picked up the small USB drive. She held it up. "Mr. Thorne claims I am erratic. He claims I am unfit. But while my husband was building his logistics empire, he forgot one thing. He forgot that before I was his wife, before I was an art history major, I was a bookkeeper for my father's small business. I know numbers, Your Honor, and for the last 2 years, while Julian thought I was drinking wine and browsing the internet, I was tracking every single ship in his fleet." Julian's foot stopped tapping. He frowned. "I don't want alimony," Yuki said, her voice rising slightly. "And I don't care about the apartment in Queens. I am here to prove that Vance Halloway Logistics is not just a shipping company. It is a laundering operation for the Sinaloa cartel." The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. "Objection!" Thorne roared, jumping to his feet so fast his chair toppled over. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of delusion we spoke of. This is slander, libel. I move to have Mrs. Vance held in contempt immediately." "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," Judge Sterling barked. His eyes narrowed. He looked at Yuki, intrigued for the first time. "Mrs. Vance, that is a catastrophic accusation. You are accusing a Fortune 500 CEO of international drug trafficking in a divorce court?" "I am, Your Honor," Yuki said calmly. Julian let out another laugh, but this one sounded forced, high-pitched. "She's insane. Do you hear this? She's watching too much Netflix. Judge, please get her some medical help." Yuki ignored him. "Mr. Thorne submitted affidavits from the staff. I would like to submit Exhibit 1. She walked to the bailiff and handed him a thick stack of papers she pulled from her tote bag. The bailiff handed them to the judge. "These are shipping manifests," Yuki explained, "from the Vance Global subsidiary. My husband claims these ships transport agricultural machinery to South America, specifically harvesters and tractors." Julian's face went a shade paler. He unbuttoned his jacket, loosening his tie. "If you look at page 4, Your Honor," Yuki continued, reciting the numbers from memory without looking at a paper, "you will see the weight discrepancies. A standard shipment of John Deere X9 combines weighs exactly 32 tons per unit. The manifests for the Sea Serpent, a ship owned by my husband, declares the weight at 18 tons per unit. Yet, the fuel consumption logs, which I accessed from the captain's private server, password Vance King, show the ship was burning fuel consistent with a full 32-ton load." Judge Sterling flipped to page 4. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the fuel logs. He looked at the manifest. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "can you explain why your client's ships are declaring half their weight to customs, but burning fuel for a full load? What is inside those containers that doesn't appear on the scale?" Thorne was sweating. He looked at Julian. Julian wasn't looking at the judge. He was staring at Yuki with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Clerical errors," Thorne stammered. "Paperwork mix-ups. This proves nothing but bad accounting." "Perhaps," Yuki said, cutting him off. "But bad accounting doesn't usually involve shell companies in the Cayman Islands paying the captain of these ships $2 million a year, a captain whose legal name is Marco Velez, a known associate of the cartel." Yuki turned to the gallery, then back to Julian. "You laughed when I said I'd represent myself, Julian. You thought because I didn't have a law degree, I was stupid. But you left your laptop open every night. You used your birthday as your password, and you synced your phone to the family cloud." She reached into her bag and pulled out a photo. It was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Julian shaking hands with a man on a dock, a man with a distinct tattoo on his neck. "Exhibit 2, Yuki said, her voice ringing like a bell. "My husband meeting with Hector Salamanca in Veracruz, 3 days before the sea serpent departed. Mr. Thorne said Julian was at a golf retreat in Florida. Here is the geotagged metadata from the photo." Thorne was paralyzed. He was a divorce lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney. He looked at the photo, then at Julian. "You told me you were in West Palm Beach," Thorne hissed. Julian stood up, his face purple. "This is illegal. She hacked my phone. That's inadmissible. Fruit of the poisonous tree." "Actually," Judge Sterling interrupted, a cold smile touching his lips, "in a civil divorce proceeding, regarding shared marital property, which your phone is, there is no expectation of privacy between spouses unless explicitly separated. The evidence is admissible." The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Vance, you mentioned a USB drive?" "Yes, Your Honor," Yuki said. "It contains the audio recordings." "Audio?" Julian whispered. The color drained from his face completely. "The baby monitor," Yuki said, looking Julian dead in the eyes. "You put one in your home office when Leo was born, so you could hear if he cried while you worked. You forgot to turn it off. For 3 years." She plugged the USB into the court's AV system. "Play file dated November 14th, 2024, she instructed the clerk. Static filled the courtroom speakers. Then Julian's voice, crystal clear and arrogant. "Don't worry about the inspectors. I bought the Port Authority chief a villa in Tuscany. He won't open a single crate. Just make sure the snow is packed inside the engine blocks. If Yuki asks, we're having a record profit year." Then another voice, Thorne's voice. "Make sure the money goes through the charity foundation first. If you divorce her, we frame her for the embezzlement. We'll make it look like she was stealing to fund a gambling addiction." The recording stopped. The silence in the courtroom was terrifying. Every eye turned to Marcus Thorne. The shark was trembling. Judge Sterling slowly took off his glasses. He looked at the bailiff. "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves this room." He turned to Julian, who had slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "It seems your wife is not the one with the delusion." The courtroom was sealed. 2 armed bailiffs stood in front of the heavy oak doors, arms crossed, hands resting near their holsters. The air conditioning hummed, but everyone in the room was sweating. Julian Vance was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. He turned his head slowly toward Marcus Thorne. The butcher was frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "What are you doing?" Julian hissed, his voice low but audible in the silent room. "I'm asserting my Fifth Amendment rights," Thorne whispered back, sweat beading on his forehead. "I'm done, Julian. You didn't tell me she had the house bugged. You didn't tell me the manifests were doctored so blatantly. You told me how to hide the money," Julian snapped, his voice rising. "You're my lawyer. You fix this. Fix it now, or I swear to God I will drag you down with me." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. "Mr. Vance! Mr. Thorne! Silence!" The judge's face was red with fury. "I have just heard evidence of a conspiracy to commit money laundering, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Mr. Thorne, regarding your objection about the recording being inadmissible due to attorney-client privilege." The judge leaned over the bench, staring Thorne down like a hawk eyeing a field mouse. "The crime-fraud exception applies here. Attorney-client privilege does not protect communications made to further a crime. That recording is admissible. And frankly, Mr. Thorne, it sounds like you are a co-conspirator, not legal counsel." Thorne stood up, his usual arrogance completely evaporated. He looked small. "Your Honor, I was acting under duress. Mr. Vance is a powerful man. I fear for my safety." Julian's jaw dropped. "You coward! You took 30% of the cut. Sit down!" the bailiff shouted, stepping forward. Yuki watched them. She hadn't moved. She stood perfectly still at her table, watching the two men who had tormented her turn on each other like starving wolves. It was pathetic. It was satisfying. "I have one more piece of evidence to present regarding the finances," Yuki said, her voice cutting through their bickering. "And I have one final witness to call." Julian laughed again, but it was a manic, broken sound. "Witness? Who?" "You have no friends, Yuki. I isolated you from everyone. Who are you going to call? The gardener?" Yuki looked at the back of the courtroom. "I call Isabella Ricci to the stand." The blood drained from Julian's face so fast he looked like a corpse. Isabella Ricci, his executive assistant, his confidant, his mistress of 3 years, the woman he had promised to marry once he dealt with the crazy wife, the woman who knew where every single body was buried because she had helped dig the graves. "Isabella," Julian whispered. A smile crept onto his face. Relief washed over him. "Oh, thank God." He leaned toward Thorne, who was currently trying to text someone under the table. "It's okay. She loves me. She'll deny everything. She's going to say Yuki is lying." The side door opened. Isabella Ricci walked in. She was stunning, dressed in a sharp black power suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She walked with confidence, her heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. She walked past the defense table. Julian reached out a hand to touch her arm, a gesture of possession. "Bella," he whispered. Isabella didn't even blink. She pulled her arm away as if he were contagious, not even looking at him. She walked straight to the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. Julian's hand remained in the air, grasping at nothing. "State your name and relationship to the defendant," Yuki asked. She didn't sound like a scorned wife asking her husband's lover a question. She sounded like a prosecutor. "Isabella Marie Ricci," the woman said, her voice steady. "I am the Vice President of Internal Operations for Vance Holloway Logistics. And I was Julian Vance's mistress for 3 years. A gasp went through the gallery. The press reporters were scribbling furiously. "Ms. Ricci," Yuki continued, pacing slowly in front of the stand. "Why are you here today?" Isabella looked at Julian. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I'm here because he promised me he would leave you," Isabella said, addressing Yuki but looking at Julian. "He told me you were abusive. He told me you were mentally ill. He told me he needed my help to hide the assets so you wouldn't spend them on drugs." "And when did you realize that was a lie?" Yuki asked. 6 months ago, Isabella said, "when I found the emails he was sending to his other mistress in London, and when I found the folder on his computer labeled Ricci Liability." Julian stood up, knocking his chair over. Isabella, don't do this. I love you. We're going to Fiji next week. Don't listen to her. Sit down, Mr. Vance, or you will be shackled, the judge roared. Two bailiffs moved behind Julian, forcing him back into his chair. Isabella continued, her voice hardening. I realized I was just another pawn, just like you, Yuki. So I did some digging. I found the liability folder. It wasn't just about firing me. It contained a plan to implicate me in the cartel laundering if the feds ever came sniffing. He was going to set me up as the mastermind. She reached into a briefcase and pulled out a blue ledger. This, Isabella said, holding it up, is the real ledger, not the one on the servers. This is the handwritten ledger Julian keeps in his safe at the penthouse. The combination is 08-12-88, his birthday. Yuki nodded. And what does that ledger show, Ms. Ricci? It shows direct payments from the Sinaloa cartel labeled as consulting fees, Isabella said. It shows bribes paid to port officials in Miami, Newark, and Rotterdam. And it shows a payment of $500,000 to a private investigator to stalk and harass Yuki Vance to induce psychological distress. The courtroom was dead silent. Yuki looked at the judge. Gaslighting, Yuki said softly. It wasn't just him being mean. It was a paid service. He hired men to move things in my house, to make strange noises at night, to follow me, all to make me think I was going crazy so he could get full custody and keep his money. Julian was shaking his head, muttering to himself. No, no, no. Ms. Ricci, Yuki asked one final question. How did you get that ledger out of the safe? Isabella finally looked at Yuki, and a small, sad smile appeared. Because on the night of November 14th, you called me. The court gasped again. You called me, Isabella repeated. You told me everything. You didn't scream at me. You didn't blame me. You warned me. You told me he was going to destroy me next. We met for coffee the next day, and we decided that if he wanted to play games, we would play to win. Yuki turned to the judge. The defense rests, Your Honor. The silence that followed Isabella Ricci's testimony was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating silence of a bomb having just detonated, with the shock wave still rippling through the air. Judge Arthur C. Sterling sat motionless on his bench. His face, usually a mask of judicial indifference, was twisted in a mixture of fury and disbelief. He stared at the blue ledger resting on the witness stand, a book that contained the ruin of a dynasty. Then he slowly shifted his gaze to the defense table. Julian Vance was no longer the picture of the untouchable billionaire. He was slumped in his chair, his face a sheen of cold sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had woken up in a nightmare and couldn't find the exit. Beside him, Marcus Thorne, the butcher of Manhattan, was frantically shoving documents into his leather briefcase, his hands trembling so violently that papers were spilling onto the floor. Mr. Thorne, Judge Sterling said. His voice was dangerously low, barely a whisper, yet it carried to the back of the room. Where do you think you are going? Thorne froze. He looked up, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Your Honor, I must request an immediate recess. I need to confer with my client. There has been a significant breach of privilege here. This testimony, the judge interrupted, his voice rising to a thunderous boom that made the gallery jump, has just implicated you as a co-conspirator in a federal racketeering enterprise. Do you take this court for a fool, Mr. Thorne? Do you think attorney-client privilege shields you when you are actively helping your client structure money laundering schemes? I didn't know, Thorne squeaked, his voice cracking. I was just handling the divorce. I had no knowledge of the cartels. Liar! Julian suddenly screamed. He jumped to his feet, knocking his expensive chair backward with a loud clatter. He pointed a shaking finger at his lawyer. "You set up the shell companies. You told me how to funnel the cash through the charitable foundation. You took a 30% cut, you leech." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," the bailiff shouted, hand moving to his belt. "He's lying," Thorne yelled back, abandoning all professional decorum. "He forced me. He threatened my firm." Yuki watched them from her table. She hadn't moved a muscle. She stood perfectly straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She watched the two men who had controlled her life, one with fear, the other with legal threats, tear each other apart. It was pathetic. It was inevitable. "Your Honor," Yuki said. Her voice cut through their shouting match like a razor blade. The room fell silent again. Julian turned to look at her. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifying mix of hatred and desperation. "I have no further witnesses," Yuki said calmly. "However, before you make your ruling, I would like to make a closing statement. Since I represent myself, I believe that is my right." Judge Sterling looked at her. The respect in his eyes was undeniable. "Proceed, Mrs. Vance." Yuki stepped out from behind her table. She walked to the center of the room, standing in the open space between the bench and the gallery. She didn't look at the judge. She turned her body so she was facing Julian directly. "For 10 years, Yuki began, her voice steady and clear. "You told me I was nothing. You told me I was lucky you picked me. You told me I was too stupid to understand your business, too emotional to handle the finances, and too weak to leave you." She took a step closer to him. Julian flinched. "You laughed at me, Julian. When I stood up today and said I didn't have a lawyer, you laughed. You thought this was a game. You thought you could buy the judge, buy the press, and buy my silence just like you bought your reputation." Yuki gestured to the empty air where Thorne had tried to build his defense. "But you made a critical error. You assumed that because I was quiet, I was blind. You assumed that because I was a housewife, I was helpless. You were so busy building your empire of lies that you didn't notice the person taking notes in the background. You didn't notice me learning the tax codes. You didn't notice me tracking the flight logs. You didn't notice me befriending the people you treated like garbage. Your staff, your assistants, your victims." Julian's face crumpled. "Yuki, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did it for us. The money. It was for Leo. It was for our future." "Do not speak his name," Yuki said, and for the first time her voice shook with rage. "You didn't do it for Leo. You did it for your ego. You laundered blood money through a shipping company and put our son in a house, bugged by the cartel. You risked his life every single day so you could feel like a god." She turned back to the judge. "Mr. Thorne argued that I am delusional. He argued that I am unfit. But the evidence before you, the ledgers, the recordings, the testimony of Ms. Ricci, proves that the only delusion in this room was my husband's belief that he was above the law. I am asking for full custody. I am asking for the immediate dissolution of this marriage. And I am asking that the court turn over all evidence presented today to the appropriate authorities." "Yuki, stop," Julian begged, tears streaming down his face now. He rounded the table, moving toward her. "Baby, please, we can fix this. I can explain. We can go away. I have money in Switzerland. Millions. We can disappear tonight. Just tell the judge you made it up. Please!" Two bailiffs lunged forward to intercept him, but they stopped when the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was a phalanx of 12 federal agents. They wore navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the chest, FBI. They were armed, armored, and they did not look like they were there to negotiate. At the front of the formation stood Special Agent Sarah Miller. She was a tall woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much darkness. She scanned the room, her gaze locking instantly on the defense table. "Seal the exits," Miller commanded. Her voice was authoritative, honed by years of field operations. 4 agents peeled off, blocking the side doors. The rest marched down the center aisle, the sound of their heavy boots thudding in rhythm against the floor. The gallery of spectators pressed themselves against the back walls, terrified. Judge Sterling didn't look surprised. He simply sat back and nodded. Agent Miller stopped 10 feet from Julian Vance. She pulled a folded document from her jacket pocket. "Julian Vance?" she asked, though she clearly knew exactly who he was. Julian stumbled back, hitting the edge of the table. This is a divorce court. You have no jurisdiction here. I want to call the governor. I know the governor." "The governor isn't going to help you, Mr. Vance," Miller said coldly. "He's currently answering questions about his campaign donations from your shell company." She unfolded the warrant. "Julian Vance, you are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are charged with conspiracy to violate the RICO Act, international money laundering, 4 counts of wire fraud, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics." She turned to Thorne, who was cowering under the table. "Get up!" she snapped. Thorne slowly rose, his face the color of ash. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, aiding and abetting a criminal enterprise, and tampering with witnesses." "No," Julian whispered. He looked at Yuki. "Yuki, tell them it's a mistake." Yuki looked at him. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. She expected to feel joy, she expected to feel triumph. But looking at him now, this small, terrified man who was about to lose everything, she felt nothing but a cool, distant pity. "It's not a mistake, Julian," she said softly. "It's justice." "Cuff them," Miller ordered. The agents moved in a swarm. Julian tried to resist. He shoved the first agent, screaming, "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am? I am Vance Holloway. I own this city." The agents didn't care. They spun him around, slamming him face first onto the defense table, the same table where he had sat laughing just an hour ago. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was sharp and final. "You have the right to remain silent," an agent recited, hauling Julian to his feet. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Yuki!" Julian screamed as they dragged him backward toward the doors. He was thrashing, his bespoke suit twisting, his dignity completely stripped away. "You'll pay for this! You'll have nothing! You hear me? You're nothing without me!" Yuki stood her ground. She watched him being hauled away, his screams echoing down the marble hallway outside until the elevator doors chimed and cut off the sound. Thorne went quietly, weeping openly, his head hung low as he realized his career, his reputation, and his freedom were gone forever. The courtroom emptied of the federal agents, leaving a vacuum of silence in their wake. The press, stunned into uncharacteristic quiet, stared at the woman standing alone in the center of the room. Judge Sterling took a deep breath. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked down at his clerk, who was typing furiously, trying to capture the record of what had just happened. "The record will reflect," the judge said, his voice weary but firm, "that the defendant and his counsel have been taken into federal custody." He turned his gaze to Yuki. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling said. "Yes, Your Honor. In 30 years on the bench, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen the best attorneys in the country argue in this room." The judge leaned forward, his expression softening into a rare, genuine smile. "But I have never seen a litigant represent themselves with such precision, such courage, and such absolute command of the truth. Yuki felt the first tear slip down her cheek. Not a tear of sadness, but of release. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her legs trembling. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. "The petition for divorce is granted immediately on the grounds of felony conviction and extreme cruelty," the judge ruled, banging his gavel with a definitive crack. "Sole legal and physical custody of the minor child, Leo Vance, is awarded to the mother. All marital assets not subject to federal seizure are awarded to the plaintiff. Restraining orders are effective immediately and permanently." He stood up, gathering his robe. "You are free, Mrs. Vance." Yuki closed her eyes. Free. She turned around. Isabella was still sitting in the witness box, looking shell-shocked. Yuki walked over to her. "We did it," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Yuki said, opening her eyes and looking toward the exit signs that glowed a bright, promising red. "We didn't just do it. We finished it." She picked up her tote bag, the bag that held her notebook, her evidence, and her future. She didn't look back at the empty defense table. She turned her back on the wreckage of her marriage and began to walk toward the doors. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The storm had broken, and for the first time in 10 years, Yuki Vance walked out into the sunlight without a shadow hanging over her. The immediate aftermath of the verdict wasn't a celebration. It was a hurricane of noise, followed by a silence so profound it felt heavy. When Yuki stepped out of the courthouse doors that afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the world seemed to be vibrating. The press barricades were overflowing. Hundreds of cameras flashed in unison, creating a strobe light effect that made Yuki dizzy. Microphones were thrust over the railing like spears. They shouted questions that blurred into a wall of sound. "Mrs. Vance, did you know about the cartel? How long were you planning this? Are you afraid for your life?" Yuki didn't answer. She simply held her head high, gripped the strap of her tote bag, the bag that had contained the destruction of an empire, and walked toward the modest sedan Isabella had waiting at the curb. She didn't look back at the courthouse, where her husband was currently being processed by federal marshals. She didn't look back at the life that had been a golden cage for 10 years. The ride to the temporary safe house the FBI had arranged was silent. Isabella drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. "You okay?" Isabella asked, her voice raspy. She looked drained, the veneer of the corporate shark completely stripped away. "I don't know," Yuki whispered, staring out the window as the New York skyline retreated. "I don't know what okay feels like anymore." The first month, decompression. The first few weeks were a blur of bureaucracy and cardboard boxes. The federal government moved quickly. The Vance Holloway assets were frozen immediately. The penthouse on Park Avenue, the villa in Tuscany, the yacht Sea Serpent. It all became evidence. Yuki was allowed to return to the penthouse one last time, accompanied by 2 FBI agents, to retrieve personal effects that were not purchased with illicit funds. Walking into that apartment was like walking into a mausoleum. It was cold, smelling of expensive leather and stale air. Yuki walked past the grand piano she was never allowed to play because Julian said it gave him a headache. She walked past the dining table where he had berated her for undercooking the steak, where he had laughed at her ideas, where he had systematically dismantled her self-esteem. "Just personal items, Mom," Agent Miller said gently from the doorway. "Clothes, photos, the boys' toys." Yuki went to the master bedroom. She opened the closet. She looked at the rows of designer dresses Julian had bought her. Dresses she hated. Dresses that were meant to make her look like a trophy, a prop for his arm at galas. She left them all. Instead, she packed her old sweaters. She packed the photo albums of Leo from before things got bad. She packed her art history books, the ones Julian had told her to throw away because nobody cares about old paintings. She went to Leo's room. It was untouched, a shrine to a childhood interrupted. She packed his Lego sets, his stuffed bear, Mr. Truffles, and his drawing pad. As she was zipping up the suitcase, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from a news app. Breaking: Julian Vance denied bail, faces 40 years to life. The article had a photo of Julian being led out of the arraignment hearing. He looked haggard. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrified, hollow stare. He wasn't laughing anymore. Yuki looked at the screen for a long moment. She waited for the satisfaction, the rush of victory. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion. She didn't hate him anymore. Hate required energy. She just wanted him to be a memory. She put the phone in her pocket, grabbed the suitcase, and walked out of the penthouse. She left the keys on the marble counter and didn't close the door behind her. The second month, the truth and the boy. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle, it was Leo. Leo was 7. He was old enough to know something was wrong, but too young to understand the complexities of money laundering and federal indictments. He had been staying with Yuki's sister in Vermont during the trial, shielded from the worst of it. When Yuki finally drove up to get him, the reunion was tearful. Leo clung to her leg, burying his face in her coat. "Is Daddy coming?" he asked, his voice muffled. Yuki knelt down in the gravel driveway, ignoring the cold dampness seeping into her jeans. She took Leo's face in her hands. She had practiced this speech 1,000 times in the mirror. But now, looking into his innocent eyes that looked so much like Julian's, the words caught in her throat. "No, Leo," she said softly. "Daddy isn't coming." "Is he working?" "No, sweetie. Daddy did some bad things. He broke the rules. Big rules." Yuki took a breath. When grown-ups break big rules, they have to go away for a long time to think about what they did. "He's in a place called prison." Leo blinked. "Like in the movies? With the bad guys?" "Yes," Yuki said honestly. She refused to lie to him. Julian had built their life on lies. She would build their new life on truth. "But he's safe, and we're safe. That's the most important thing. You and I are safe now. No more yelling. No more secrets." Leo looked at her, processing this. "Does this mean we're poor now?" Julian had always threatened that. "If you leave me, you'll be on the street. You'll be poor." He had terrified the boy with stories of poverty. "We aren't rich like before," Yuki said, smiling. "We won't have the big house. But we have enough. And we have each other. And nobody is ever going to make us feel small again." Leo seemed to accept this. He hugged her again. "I like small houses better anyway," he whispered. The big house was scary at night. Yuki held him tight, tears finally spilling over. Julian thought he was protecting his legacy by fighting for custody. He never realized that his son was terrified of the very empire he had built. Waterstow, the 3rd month, the settlement and the shadow. The dust began to settle. The media cycle moved on to the next scandal, leaving Yuki in peace. She rented a small, charming cottage in upstate New York, near a lake. It had creaky floorboards, a drafty window in the kitchen, and a porch that looked out over the water. It was imperfect, and Yuki loved every inch of it. One Tuesday morning, Isabella Ricci pulled into the driveway. Isabella's life had imploded too, but in a different way. She had avoided prison thanks to her cooperation and Yuki's testimony on her behalf, but she was a pariah in the corporate world. She was currently working as a consultant for a non-profit, earning a fraction of her former salary, but she looked younger, lighter. She carried a thick manila envelope. Coffee? Yuki asked, opening the screen door. Strong, black, Isabella said, stepping inside. She placed the envelope on the kitchen table. It's done. The forensic accountants finished the audit. Yuki poured the coffee, her hands steady. And? The government seized everything connected to the logistics company. The ships, the warehouses, the offshore accounts. It's all gone, Isabella said. However, she tapped the envelope. Judge Sterling ruled on the premarital assets. The trust fund Julian's grandmother left him in 1995. It was never commingled with the cartel money. It's clean. And since Julian owes you millions in back pay for emotional damages and restitution, Isabella slid the envelope across the table. It's yours, Yuki. $10 million. Clean. Tax-free. It's officially in your name as of this morning. Yuki stared at the envelope. She didn't open it. $10 million. It was enough to never work again. It was enough to buy a mansion. I don't want a mansion, Yuki said aloud. I figured, Isabella smirked. But maybe you can fix the heating in this place. It's freezing. Yuki laughed. It was a genuine sound. Maybe. She looked at Isabella. Their relationship was strange. They shouldn't be friends. Isabella had slept with her husband. She had helped gaslight her. But in the fire of that courtroom, they had forged a bond that defied logic. They were the only two people on earth who truly understood the monster Julian was. How are you doing, really? Yuki asked. Isabella looked down at her coffee cup. I'm in therapy. Trying to figure out why I let a man control me for so long. Trying to figure out why I thought money was worth my soul. She looked up, her eyes fierce. But I'm free. For the first time in my life, I don't have to answer to anyone. Me neither, Yuki said. So, Isabella leaned back. You're rich. You're free. You have Leo. What are you going to do with the rest of your life, Yuki Vance? You're only 32. Yuki stood up and walked to the kitchen counter. There was a letter there, unopened. It had arrived 2 days ago. The return address was the Harvard Law School, admissions office. She handed it to Isabella. Isabella ripped it open. She scanned the page, her eyes widening. No way. I applied 3 weeks after the trial, Yuki admitted. Judge Sterling wrote my letter of recommendation. Apparently, dismantling a cartel pro se looks good on a resume. Isabella laughed, a loud barking sound of delight. You got in. Full ride. No, you don't need the money, but still. Yuki, this is incredible. I spent 10 years being told I was stupid, Yuki said, looking out the window at the lake. I spent 10 years being told my only value was my appearance. When I stood in that courtroom, when I cross-examined Thorne, I felt alive. I realized I didn't just want to save myself. I wanted to make sure men like Julian and Thorne never win again. Lawyer Yuki, Isabella mused. God help the opposition. The final scene, embers 6 months post-trial. The autumn leaves were turning gold and crimson around the lake house. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. Yuki sat on the porch swing, a thick textbook open on her lap. Constitutional law, principles and policies. She highlighted a passage, muttering to herself about due process. The screen door banged open. Leo ran out, holding a stick that looked vaguely like a sword. Mum! Mum! I defeated the dragon! He yelled, pointing to a pile of raked leaves. Good job, brave knight, Yuki smiled, closing her book. Did the dragon have any treasure? Just a pine cone, Leo said, presenting it to her. Yuki took the pine cone with the reverence of a queen, accepting a crown jewels. She placed it on the railing next to her tea. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was open. Yuki saw the mail carrier drive away. She walked down the gravel path to check it. Inside was a single white envelope. The return address was stamped in red ink. USP Canaan, Federal Penitentiary. It was from Julian. Yuki stood by the mailbox, holding the letter. She could feel the weight of it. She knew what was inside, pages of excuses, pages of begging, or perhaps pages of rage. He was trying to reach out, to hook his claws back into her, to take up space in her mind. For a moment, her hand trembled. The old fear, the conditioned response to his presence, flickered in her chest. Then, she looked back at the house. She saw Leo jumping into the pile of leaves, shrieking with joy. She saw her law book on the swing. She saw the peace she had built, with her own 2 hands. She didn't open the letter. Yuki walked to the fire pit in the side yard, where they had burned some brush earlier that day. The embers were still glowing, faint orange eyes in the ash. She tossed the envelope onto the coals. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the paper curled. The edges turned black. A small flame caught, blue and yellow, licking at the words she would never read. She watched the ink dissolve into smoke. She watched Julian's name turn to ash and float up into the cool autumn air, dispersing until there was nothing left but the sky. She felt lighter than she ever had in her life. "Mom," Leo called out, "are you coming?" Yuki turned her back on the fire. She smiled, a bright, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'm coming, Leo," she called back. She ran across the grass to join her son, leaving the ashes of her past to be carried away by the wind, gone forever. What Yuki Vance did wasn't just about winning a court case. It was about reclaiming her reality. In a world that told her she was weak, crazy, and incapable, she used the very tools of her oppression, silence and observation, to forge her weapon. Julian Vance had billions of dollars, ruthless lawyers, and the arrogance of a king, but he lacked the one thing Yuki had in abundance: the truth. This story is a reminder to never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who listen more than they speak. And most importantly, it's a lesson to anyone feeling trapped. Your greatest strength often lies in the very place people think you are weakest. If Yuki's justice gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Did you see the twist with the mistress coming? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story of Justice Served Cold. Thanks for watching.